Hello everyone. Today I want to share a very painful and difficult story about my decision to end my marriage. After numerous warnings, I couldn't take it anymore when my brother-in-law kept invading our personal space. Join me as I go through the emotions, decisions, and reasons behind this major change in my life. Hello everyone. Today I want to share a story about a painful decision I just made when I had to end my marriage. What I'm about to say may surprise many of you, but this is the truth. After a long period of struggle, I couldn't endure it anymore when the issues with my wife's family remained unresolved. My marriage had been threatened by the lack of boundaries with her family, especially her brother. When we first met, everything was sweet. I loved my wife very much and always wanted to help her in every situation. We got married and started our life together. At first, I felt very happy. However, over time, I began to notice something wasn't right. Although my wife and her family were very close, I felt neglected and invaded in my own space. It started with small things, like them coming into the house without notice, eating my food, and even using our private bathroom when there was another bathroom available nearby. These actions seemed harmless at first, but gradually, they made me feel frustrated. I tried to talk to my wife about this issue many times. I asked her to respect our private space and hoped that her family would understand that this was our shared life as a couple. But my wife had no way of handling the situation. She always felt it was hard to say no to her family. She would say that they needed help, and I couldn't refuse. I understood and sympathized, but this situation dragged on and drained me. I thought it was just a temporary phase, and everything would get better with time, but it didn't. One day, after I came home and saw my brother-in-law again in the living room, lying on the couch with his shoes on, looking as if he was completely at ease, I knew I couldn't take it anymore. This wasn't the first time he had invaded our space, and this time, it was the last straw. My feelings at that moment were heavy. Not only did I feel disappointed in my wife's family, but I also felt abandoned by my wife in the fight to reclaim our space and rights. Without her support, I realized that everything had come to an end. After enduring and struggling for so long, I began to feel that this was no longer a temporary situation. Every time I made a request, or even just gently reminded her about her family invading our space, my wife would respond in strange ways. She never stood up for me. She never did anything to stop those violations. Even though I clearly told her that I needed her support and that we needed a private life and respect, those words seemed to fall on deaf ears. I started to feel lonely in my own relationship. I loved my wife and had tried my best to maintain happiness, but it seemed that I only received silence, indifference, and a lack of empathy from her. Even after her family had intruded into our home repeatedly, I never received an apology or acknowledgement that what they did was wrong. She never showed any sympathy or took responsibility for how her family was hurting me. My wife had a very close-knit family, and I understood that. But the issue was that she had placed her family above our relationship. Our relationship was being overshadowed by the unclear boundaries between us and her family, being invaded every day. The repeated lack of respect from her family made me feel like I was no longer an important part of her life. Even though I loved my wife deeply, I also needed my own space. I needed respect. She didn't realize that this relationship couldn't grow when I constantly felt like an outsider in my own home. Gradually, these feelings became an unbearable burden. I tried to be patient, but when all my efforts went unacknowledged, I started to feel like a stranger in my own life. And then, one day, when my brother-in-law continued to intrude into our space without any shame, I couldn't control my emotions anymore. The feelings of hopelessness and disappointment weighed heavily on me. The signs were clear, and I knew I couldn't endure this anymore. That was the moment I realized that I could no longer live in a relationship where respect and boundaries were never a priority. After I started to feel lonely in my relationship, thoughts about the future began to surface. I couldn't continue living in a marriage where mutual respect and privacy were non-existent. Every time my wife didn't stand up for me, didn't protect me from her family, I felt abandoned. When her brother came to the house, lying on the couch with his dirty shoes, or entering our room without hesitation. It was the last straw. Those situations were unacceptable, and it seemed that my wife always chose her family over me. I had tried to create conversations, serious discussions about this. I asked my wife to stand up for our space, to realize that our relationship should be prioritized over any other. But nothing changed. She couldn't see the pain I was going through. She only saw her family and couldn't understand that their actions were ruining our happiness. Even when I started expressing my discomfort and disappointment, my wife would just respond with "they need help. They have nowhere else to go." I understood that her family was going through difficult times, but I couldn't continue living in an environment where every day I felt pushed aside. I needed a partner, a spouse, not someone who always prioritized their family and ignored my feelings. When my patience reached its limit, I realized that there was no chance for change. This relationship couldn't continue without respect and support from both sides. The emotions I had bottled up, the unspoken disappointment, led to the difficult decision I had to make. I couldn't live in a marriage where I didn't feel loved and respected. After realizing that my efforts were no longer enough to maintain this relationship, I began to feel like I was living in a meaningless marriage. I had tried my best to keep things intact, but the disappointment and hurt just kept growing every day. Every time I saw her family continue to invade our privacy without any change, I felt like I was the outsider in my own home. My wife didn't stand up for me, didn't share my concerns about this situation, and that made me feel completely alone. My wife seemed to not understand the seriousness of the issue. Even though I tried to explain that the constant presence of her family in our lives was hurting our relationship, she couldn't change her attitude. She seemed unable to realize that their actions were not only a physical invasion, but also an invasion of the basic values of marriage. Love, respect, and mutual protection are essential, and I couldn't continue living in a relationship where they weren't valued. That day, when my brother-in-law again came into our home and acted as if he could freely come and go without notice or respect for our space, I couldn't hold back my emotions anymore. This wasn't the first time he had done this, but this time, my patience had completely run out. I tried to hold back, but it felt like a cup that was full, and the final drop made it overflow. At that moment, I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. This relationship was no longer salvageable. My efforts had gone unanswered, and I couldn't stand the lack of respect any longer. I loved my wife, but I also loved myself, and I felt that I deserved to live in a healthy relationship where both of us respected and protected each other. So, I decided that there would be no more chances. I couldn't live in a marriage without understanding, respect, and support from both sides. I understand that this is an extremely painful decision, but I couldn't continue living in pretense. I couldn't keep giving without receiving. I no longer felt like an important part of my wife's life, and I couldn't continue in a marriage without her support. In the end, I decided to end the relationship, even though my heart ached when making this decision. After deciding to end the relationship, I felt an emptiness that I had never imagined I would go through. As I packed my things and prepared to leave, everything became more unclear and complicated than ever before. I had loved my wife very much, and this decision was not something I wanted, but I also realized that I couldn't continue living in a relationship without respect and support from both sides. The feeling of disappointment overwhelmed me, but I understood that this was necessary to protect myself and the values I held dear in life. Throughout this time, I had tried to preserve the marriage. I had tried to understand and share the burden with my wife, even though at times it made me feel like I was being forced to compromise too much. I loved her, but when her family continued to invade our space, I realized that this relationship had lost its balance. I had waited for change, hoped that my wife would realize the seriousness of the issue, but in the end, nothing changed. Not only her family, but also my wife couldn't realize that support and respect were two elements that are essential in any relationship. Her lack of empathy made me feel like I was fighting alone. My feelings at this moment were very contradictory. Although I knew I had done the right thing by deciding to leave, my heart still hurt. I couldn't help but think about all that was lost. There had been so many happy moments, so many beautiful memories I had shared with her. But now, everything had become the past. I couldn't continue burying myself in a marriage where I no longer felt loved and respected. My wife called me right after I left. She cried and begged me to come back. But at that moment, I no longer felt love or empathy. I couldn't go back to a relationship where I felt like I no longer recognized myself. I had tried, I had fought, and in the end, I realized that sometimes, keeping a marriage isn't always the right decision. Love can't survive in a relationship lacking respect and support. And so, I decided that this was the right step for me. I no longer felt I could sleep soundly next to her, and although I loved her, I had to face the truth that this relationship had ended. In the end, this decision was for myself. I needed to protect myself, and I couldn't allow myself to continue living in a marriage full of hurt. After deciding to leave, I felt like I had lost a huge part of my life. Although I knew this decision was right, the pain was unavoidable. I had loved my wife, and ending this relationship wasn't something I wanted. I couldn't help but think of all the moments we had shared, the happy times, the beautiful memories. This relationship was once so sweet, and now those memories have become a sadness when I look back. But no matter what, I understand that if I don't protect myself, I won't be able to continue. Leaving the house and leaving my wife was very painful. I had tried my best to maintain this relationship, but when there was no support, respect, and empathy from her, I couldn't stand it anymore. My wife called me right after I left, and in her voice, I could hear the fear, regret. She cried and begged me to come back, but at that moment, I couldn't. The feelings of betrayal, lack of understanding, and lack of protection from her made me feel like I had been abandoned, no longer an important part of her life. I couldn't go back to a relationship without change. I told her that my decision was final, and although I still loved her, I couldn't live in a marriage where I didn't feel respected. I had tried too hard, and I couldn't continue sacrificing without receiving attention and care from her. I didn't want this, but I also understood that sometimes forgiveness isn't the only way to solve the issue. Her silence and indifference had made me feel like I was no longer an important part of her life. And although I really wanted to come back and start over, I knew that would never happen unless there was real change from both sides. Now, I'm trying to rebuild my life. I don't know what the future will hold, but at least I feel lighter. This decision, in the end of my life, it's the beginning of a new chapter, one where I can find myself again. I hope that one day, I will be able to love and be loved without worrying about intrusion, indifference, or lack of respect. And no matter what, I know I deserve a better life, one that's not lived in the shadow of hurt.